Hey there, Banditos and Banditas. It's Mike Farah, and this is the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast. Welcome to San Diego Comic-Con week. This is the big one, folks. Unfortunately, we will not be there for the big one, but that's okay. I hope all those who are going have an absolutely fantastic time. We'll be looking for the news coming out of the convention, and things are just going to be magnificent as always. We know it. But this week, in fact, today, we have a great interview for you, as per usual. The interview is with Mike Marts. Mike is an editor extraordinaire. In fact, he's editor in chief at Mad Cave Studios. And Mad Cave is just kind of tearing it up here as a new kid on the scene in the comic book publishing world. They do things like Gotcha Man, Dick Tracy, Defenders of the Earth, licensed comics like those, as well as, original comics as well. And overseeing all of it is Mike Marts. He is a veteran of DC, ran the Batman line for a while, a veteran of Marvel, where I overlap with him for a little bit. He did some X-Men, Guardians of the Galaxy, two different stints at Marvel. But now, as I said, editor-in-chief of Mad Cave Studios. They have Flash Gordon #1, which comes out today. Go out and get it, July 24th. And let's talk to him about his 30-plus year career in comics. This is Mike Marts, Mad Cave's editor-in-chief. His name is Mike Marts. Mike, thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Great. Well, let's kick you off with our usual first question, which is, as you know, as a longtime listener, how did you first discover comic books?
I've listened to a bunch of the episodes, and I know that Adam West and the Batman TV show is a pretty common reply, but I'm in that same boat. Like, I wasn't old enough to watch it when it first came on, but I was certainly a viewer of the reruns. This is probably like mid '70s or so, and I mean, to me, that was just the best thing on earth. I had to watch it every day. I loved it. My mom ended up stitching me a homemade Batman cape that I wore everywhere. I wore to places I wasn't supposed to wear. So, I mean, that TV show was really kind of what got me into the realm of superheroes. But with comics, it was probably, I think, a family vacation in maybe 1977, and we went down to King's Dominion in Virginia, and we're staying at some hotel. And on the last day, my father was like, "Hey, if you want to get something from the gift shop, you can get something from the gift shop." And so I was looking all around at T-shirts and mugs and everything, and then I saw this spinner rack with comic books on it, and I was just like, "Oh, this is so cool! I've always wanted to get comic books." And I remember I was able to get three comics, and I got Iron Man 101, Captain America 229, and Thor maybe like 266. I still have all three copies to this day. But that was kind of like my introduction to what Marvel Comics was all about. And I was remember being surprised when I got to the end of the issues. It was kind of the end of the story, but it also said there's something else coming up next issue. I was like, what what's coming up next? Like I was just so intrigued. Um, but I didn't end up getting any of the next issues for a while, and it was probably like 3 years until I purchased another comic. So those three comics I just read the hell out of them. So much so that I think one of them doesn't even have a cover anymore. Um, but it was probably like maybe, I don't know, 1980 or so that I really hardcore got into comic books.
Do you remember how that happened? So from that initial, exposure, and then 3 years later, all of a sudden you're like pedal to the metal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my parents were going through a divorce, and my mom started dating the guy that would end up becoming my stepfather, and he had two kids, both of which, a boy and a girl, and both were right around my age. And I remember my mom saying, "Hey, we're going to go over to Mike's house and we're going to hang out for a little while." And I was like, "All right," and I was just kind of like, I knew the kids, but I was like a little nervous. I was like, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to do? Am I going to have fun? And I got to their house and I walked into their living room, which had about 300 different comic books just all around. Everywhere you could look, there was comic books. And it was mostly Marvels. And to me, that was the most comic books I'd ever seen in my entire life. And I remember thinking like, I'm gonna have a great time. And I saw the X-Men and I just like gravitated right towards it. And the girl who ended up becoming my stepsister, she was like, "This is where you got to start. You got to start with the X-Men," and that started a 40+ year love affair with the X-Men. On that fateful day, because I remember seeing the X-Men. Like I see pictures of them in the subscription ads of those early 3 comics that I had. I saw this picture of a blue guy and a steel guy, and I was like, man, who are these X-Men? I need to know who they are and to find out more. And that day at my step's house, I discovered who they were and never looked back. And that day I started collecting, and nothing was ever the same afterwards.
And when did you realize that, there were people behind these comics? Because I don't think that's right off the bat for most people that, these comics are actually created by people and that's something you can do professionally. Do you remember when that occurred to you, or at least when you thought of getting into comics professionally?
I mean, I think really early on, I did understand it because, you know, Chris Claremont was so synonymous with the X-Men, and the X-Men stories were so good. So I knew that this guy wrote this book and did it extremely well. And my stepsister, who was a few years older than me, she was a really good mentor in terms of like getting to know the comics and also getting to know like the artists. She knew this was John Byrne and this was Dave Cockrum. And she would point these things out to me, and I caught on really quickly, and I was able to differentiate between artist styles. I knew when Paul Smith came on the X-Men that it was something I'd never seen before. So really early on, I was aware of the creators and who they were and what they did. Um, I don't think I really understood at that time who the editor was, other than a name at the end of the credits, or what they did. But certainly the writers and artists and colors and everything, I was familiar with all those names at an early age.
And then, you were obviously steeped in comics at that point. You were collecting. You understood that there were creators, if not editors. Um, how did it, well, how did you break in professionally into, I mean, you've had basically editorial roles, I think, since the beginning of your career. What was what was the big break? And it was in at Marvel, right?
Yeah, it was at Marvel. It was in '93. But the few years leading up to that, you know, I had started college, and I I was studying journalism. So I was doing a lot of professional writing and some editing. But my real goal at that time was to become the next Chris Claremont. I wanted to write comic books and I wanted to write the X-Men. And I started taking it really seriously. I mailed a or I wrote into Marvel, for their submission guidelines for writing, and they sent me back a photocopied form of how to submit ideas to Marvel. And I would I gave myself a goal of coming up with a new story idea, one per week, and I'd sit there at my father's old typewriter and I'd type out the idea, and then I would mail it in. And occasionally I would receive a very nice rejection letter back. Um, but that was kind of like my routine for a while. I would write a new story every week and send it in. At the same time, I had the good luck of starting working at a comic book store during my college years. So I was, getting immersed in comic book retail and getting familiar with other companies besides Marvel. I was reading DC books and reading Valiant books, and I started to become aware of like just the bigger picture of the business and the industry as a whole. And one of our customers was this local guy who happened to be a comic book professional, and his name was Mark McKenna. And I know, a lot of people are familiar with Mark. A long time, he's been a long time inker in the industry. Got his start at Marvel, working in John Romita's bullpen. And Mark was just such a nice, kind guy, and he got to know me, and he took an interest in me, and knew that I wanted to be a comic book writer. So he offered to hand deliver some of my ideas to editors at Marvel. And so to me, this was a huge revelation, and just such a big stepping stone for me, because now I could kind of cut out the mailing in process. I could cut out the middleman of the submissions editor, whoever they were, and I could have my stories delivered directly to the editors. And two people were actually kind enough to read over my stuff and give notes. One was Ralph Macchio, and the other was Fabian Nicieza. And neither of them bought my story, but they actually read it, and I got feedback. And to me, that was like huge, and that opened my eyes to comic book editorial. And I started understanding, oh, these people who are at Marvel, who call themselves editors, they're not just proofing comic books, they're making decisions about who to hire, who the next artist should be, who the next writer should be, how the storyline should go. I started to recognize that they were the keepers of the continuity. And that to me was even more fascinating than becoming the next Chris Claremont. And I think that, combined with my focus in college on journalism and editing, kind of led me on a new path to seek out editorial. And McKenna had let me know that, oh, Marvel has an internship program. And I quickly applied, and then nervously waited by the phone, for a few weeks to hear back. And then one day I was at the comic book store, and the phone rang, and my boss picked it up, and he was like, "Mike, it's Marvel on the phone." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And my heart was beating fast, and I didn't know what they were going to tell me, but there was a great lady on the other line, Mary McFerrin, who was Tom DeFalco's assistant at the time. And she said, we'd like to accept you for our internship program. And, can you come up in a few weeks and meet your editors that you're going to be working with? And I was like, yeah, that's great. So that was kind of my foot in the door at Marvel. I started my internship in June of '93. Actually, just a few days ago, I think June 7th.
And who were you working with? Who were your editors at that point?
So Nel Yomtov was the main editor. I was working in his office, and Nel was a longtime Marvel staffer. He had worked in the bullpen. He had worked in licensing. And then a few years before I started there, he was working in editorial. And his assistant was John Lewandowski. And they were essentially the West Coast Avengers office. So it was West Coast Avengers before it became Force Works, Iron Man, War Machine, and there was a few other limited series like U.S. Agent and Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch. So it was all those characters, and I was more than happy to jump right in and help them out.
Now, did you get a assistant editor position right at the end of your internship? Did it just flow right in, or did the internship end and then there was a period of time before?
No,
that happened?
I was kind of lucky in that when my summer internship ended, I somehow finagled my way into a fall internship, which not a lot of people did at the time. But I, you know, I arranged my college schedule so that I had classes like 2 days a week, and uh, and then the other days I was either working in a comic book store or I was going into Marvel to intern. Um, so I kind of stretched the internship out another few months, and right around that time, Nel Yomtov, his assistant John, was moving into a different position. He was going to, I think, he was becoming the submissions editor at the time. So Nell was going to have a vacancy, and I was like, oh my gosh! And I loved working with Nell. He was such a good mentor and a teacher, and really just showed me the ropes on everything. So I told him I wanted to interview for the position, and he said, well, you've got like one semester of college left, right? And I was like, yeah, but don't worry, I'll finish it at night, and I'll finish it on the weekends, and I'll do whatever I have to do. And I guess he went down and tried to get permission from Tom DeFalco, who was editor in chief at the time. And you know, Tom, the way Nell tells the story, Tom, you know, got pretty heated, was like, that kid better finish college if he's going to work here. And Nell was like, yeah, no, he says he's going to finish college. And then I got offered the assistant job right at the end of '93, right around my 22nd birthday, and right around the same time as the Marvel Christmas party. And like I think like on my first or second official day of working there, I was at the Marvel Christmas party and got to meet Stan Lee. So it was a nice way to kind of officially enter into um, the Marvel company.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, what an experience, and what a first experience, I guess, getting into
Mm-hmm.
Marvel for certain. I know, even though you had been in the internship. So as an assistant editor, were you working on similar books that you were working on with the internship? Were they Avengers related? Did you have any choice whatsoever in what you worked on or edited?
I had
How did
no
that
no.
go? Yeah.
I definitely didn't have any choice. I was happy to work on whatever came our way. Um, most of a lot of the stuff that Nell had already been working on were things that I continued on. West Coast Avengers evolved into Force Works. Um, Iron Man and War Machine continued to go, and about a year into my time there is unfortunately when things started to unravel at Marvel,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I saw the acquisition of Malibu. I saw the acquisition of Heroes World, and I'm not sure all in what order they happened, but things started looking scarier. And I think about it, yeah, probably about a year into my being an assistant, um, they decided to downsize the staff, the editorial staff, which was like 60 plus people, down to like, I don't know, 30 something people. And that was also when they experimented with the thing called Marvolution, where Tom DeFalco was no longer editor in chief, and they had
Right.
promoted several of the executive editors and a few group editors to editor in chief status. And Nell and I fell under Mark Grunwald's department, which was essentially the Avengers group. It was me and Nell and Ralph Macchio and Matt Idelson, and and at that time we absorbed the Fantastic Four books. So it was Fantastic Four, Fantastic Force, Fantastic Four Unplugged, Fantastic Four Unlimited. So our workload increased, because there were fewer editors. Um, but even though it was kind of, I don't know, it was kind of shocking to a 23-year-old to see their dream company and dream world kind of start to unravel. But it was also interesting. Like, Tom DeFalco up to that point had been kind of the, I don't want to say scary editor in chief, but he was imposing, and he was, you're always kind of like, you know, were careful around Tom. And then suddenly he was our freelancer writing Fantastic Four, and then he became like your fun uncle. And he'd come into the office, and he was always in good spirits, and he would share just little tidbits on how he told stories, and to me that was just fantastic stuff. I ate it all up.
Well, it sounds like a very strange time. Both, the good and the bad and the ugly, I suppose. Um, I see in your kind of career trajectory that you left Marvel at one point, then you came back. But what caused you? Was it something? Was it even your choice that caused you to pursue? I think you went to Acclaim for a few years, Acclaim, which we know probably better as Valiant. How did that all come about for you?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. You know that that first year of Marvel layoffs happened, and then almost exactly a year later, the more brutal uh, Marvel layoff session happened, where the staff went from 30 something people down to 18. Um, I was fortunate enough to be um, uh, held on, but I'm sure it was just because I was making no money at all. Like I didn't cost the company anything as uh, a young assistant. Um, but my boss Nell got let go, and to me it was pretty devastating because he was my mentor, my leader, my friend, and I got reassigned um, some other editors, and yeah, it was just kind of daunting and scary to a young assistant. And those next few months after the big firings was pretty tough for me. And then we saw a longtime Marvel staffer, Jack Abel, pass away in the office, and you know that combined with the firings, combined with being reassigned, I it was tough for me, and I took it upon myself to say it might be good for me to go back and finish that semester of college that I never got to. So I left, and I finished my degree pretty quickly, and then of course I just scrambled to try to get back into the industry. Um, Marvel didn't have any openings, and Nel Yontov had landed over at DC, so he was kind of like my eyes and ears into DC. He would call me every time there was an assistant editor spot open at DC, and I feel like I interviewed probably like four different times over there. Mike Carlin, Dan Raspler, Casey Carlson, Stuart Moore, um, and none of those openings ended up becoming a job to me. But I interviewed with Patty Jarris in the marketing department, and I didn't get a job with her either. But she liked me, and she recommended me to Jim McLaughlin at Wizard, and he needed somebody to be the new promotions and publicity manager. So actually, I worked at Wizard for about 9 months, and I was happy to have a job in the industry again. They paid me a little bit better than what I was making at Marvel, so that was an upgrade. Um, and Wizard was a funny experience because I met so many people just because of the nature of the magazine. Like everyone from Brian Bendis to David Mack to Sean McKeever to Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. My Rolodex increased immensely. But what I discovered is that I was not very good at promotions and publicity. So after about 9 months, Wizard decided to part ways with me, which at the time seemed really devastating, but was a real blessing in disguise. And I think the day after I get let go from Wizard, the phone rings, and yeah, I thought I was never going to work in the industry again. But it was Jimmy Palmiotti calling me up, and he said, "Hey, there's an opening down at Acclaim Comics with Fabian Nicieza, and it's for an associate editor position, and I think you should go interview for it." And I knew Fabian, from my days at Marvel, and of course from reviewing my story way back in the day. And I went down and I interviewed with Fabian, and he said to me, "Hey, like I don't know if we're going to be in this New York location in 6 months. I don't know if the company is going to exist in 6 months, but if you want the job, it's yours." And so I was more than happy to take it. And dove right into a bunch of books there. I was working on Exo Manowar and Shadow Man, Trinity Angels, Doctor Mirage, and I knew all these characters because I was a fan of the kind of early Jim Shooter, Barry Windsor Smith, Valiant comics. So I loved it. And and then about 6 months to the day after Fabian hired me, um, they Acclaim Corporate decided to downsize the comic staff. So they went from 30 people down to 8 people, and they moved the 8 of us that survived out to the Long Island office. So I went from taking the train into New York City. I was in Jersey at the time, to driving out to Long Island every day for my Acclaim Comics editor job. And slowly but surely, a lot of the people that made the move out there, including Fabian, decided that was too much and they got jobs elsewhere and left. Um, until it was just like me and like one other editor and our production guy, and that was basically it. And the 3 of us were running the Acclaim Comics division, which wasn't much at the time. We were down to maybe 4 books a month, and Acclaim was using us to generate video game strategy guides because we knew publishing. I mean, I didn't know video games, but I knew publishing. So yeah, so I did that for 2 years, working as an editor at Acclaim Comics.
I can, based on the sort of names that you're dropping from Wizard, your Wizard days, I can sort of see where this is going because you do, after this Acclaim, stint, come back to Marvel. But for the audience, how did you come back to Marvel? I think maybe it has something to do with some of the names you were talking about before and Marvel Knights, but please
It
elucidate
does.
us.
Yeah, it's funny. I got real comfortable in my job at Acclaim. I really liked it. I enjoyed the autonomy that it presented, because in addition to being the editor on the books, I was also doing production work. I was doing marketing work. So I started wearing a bunch of different hats, and I really was enjoying it. So much so that I was like, oh, I'll leave Jersey and I'll move out to Long Island. So I find an apartment out in Long Island, and the very next day after moving out to Long Island, I get a phone call, and it's from Jimmy Palmiotti once again, and Jimmy says, "Hey, Bob Harris has an opening in the X-Men office, and I think you should come in and interview for it." And I was like, "All right, I'll do it." Um, and so I went in and had lunch with Bob and Mark Powers and Jason Liebig, who were the X-Men editors at the time. And they were all like, "Hey, we're overworked and we need someone else." And Matt Idelson had recently left to go to DC Comics, so there was a vacancy to be filled. And I was like, "Listen, I'll do it. I'd love to come back to Marvel and I'd love to work on the X-Men." And so I was kind of like the solo character X-Men office for a while. I was working on Wolverine, Deadpool, Bishop, Gambit, a few other odds and ends, but those were like the main things when I first got back to Marvel. And then eventually, there was further changes at Marvel, and Joe Quesada became the editor in chief, and and then maybe I don't know, maybe 2 years after Joe's tenure into being the editor in chief, he pulled me aside and he asked me if I wanted to be the primary X-Men editor. So, new X-Men and Uncanny X-Men and everything else that goes along with that.
What did you think of Marvel when you came back, and how did it differ from when you had left?
That jump that I made, I was only gone 3 years and it changed very little. Most of the faces were still the same. There was a few new young guys that had been interns maybe when I was there previously, and now they were assistants, and they all became friends of mine. Um, but it wasn't all that different. You know, Marvel Knights, of course, was a part of the company now, um, and they had come out of the bankruptcy. Um, you know, so Ike Perlmutter and the Toy Biz Group were, you know, firmly in place as leaders of the company and running the company. And yeah, maybe that was a little bit of an adjustment, but not not in a big way. You know, to me, it was kind of still the same old place, just with fewer people than back when I had first started.
But then well, you tell me, but you were sort of hinting at it when Joe became editor in chief and sort of the Bill Jemas era of Marvel. I mean, to me, I had no reference point because this is where we sort of overlapped at Marvel. But it seemed like it was not the Wild Wild West, but certainly a more experimental place
It
than it
definitely
probably
was.
had been in the past.
It definitely had been, and certainly more experimental than when I first got back to Marvel. You know, when I first got back to Marvel, they were still playing it safe, and um, the publishing line was a set amount of books, and there wasn't much look to expansion or anything like that. Um, but after Joe came in and he applied his way of doing things, it, it did become different, and it was fun. Like it just seems like every month there was something new that we were trying. You know, we had brought on Axel Alonso from DC, and you know he immediately brought his um, kind of expertise at creating distinctive comics um, with great creative voices. You know, he started doing that immediately at Marvel, so you could feel a change there. Um, Marvel brought back in a big way the trade paperback program. You know, adding staff members that would specifically work on trade paperbacks, and made that a big business again because that had kind of been abandoned for a while. And trade paperbacks became a big part of the business. At the same time, you know, Brian Michael Bendis came in, and you know, you saw a shift in the way that Marvel started telling stories, where we kind of strayed from the serialized kind of month to month adventures, continuing adventures, and things were told in a more, you know, deconstructed and, you know, writing for the story arc or writing for the trade paperback, um, which was a shift at the time. And you know, I think that whole way of telling stories has its pluses and minuses, but that was what Marvel was embracing at the time, and you know, we went full steam ahead. Also at that time, you know, the idea was that every cover needed to be a pinup, which you know I think was not the best move to make, but it was the move that was happening, and every cover was a pinup, more or less. Um, but you certainly saw um, more experimentation, and you know some things worked, some things didn't, but you saw a lot of good ideas coming in and out of the company at that time.
Were you encouraged to take big swings and be experimental? It sounds like sort of creatively, or at least maybe the talent that would be on books maybe goes in that direction. But at the same time, you have this countervailing trend of, well, let's write for the trades and let's make pinup covers. So you have some, you know, dictated structure on one hand, but also maybe a desire to be more creatively out there. Was that
I
sort
feel
of
like
your experience?
a little bit, but I feel like I was in a bit of a safe spot with the X-Men books. Not that I was protected there, but you know, the X-Men more or less worked, you know, always. And as long as there were solid creative teams on the X books, we were, I don't want to say more or less left to do our own thing, but that's how it felt a lot of the time. Occasionally when one writer was cycling out, like Joe Casey was leaving, and we brought in Chuck Austin, who I know, was on the show a few weeks ago. Um, and then eventually we brought in Joss Whedon to Astonishing X-Men. So I don't know. In the X-Men area, I was I was more or less left to kind of do my own thing with the creators I was working with. Um, and I didn't really get called upon to do too much of the experimental stuff. There were a few other editors who, um, were more like utility players and had like a hodgepodge of different assignments in their office. And I think they were probably the ones who were called upon to do more of the experimental projects. And certainly Axel, that was his specialty. So that was his comfort area.
And, after, well, let me count them up. What, 7 years there?
Yeah.
You, well, you can tell me. Did you either decided to go to DC, you got an offer you couldn't refuse? I don't know if, Marvel had anything to do with, an exit ramp there. But you were at DC. And the distinguished competition, you're, across the street, as it were. What was enticing about going to, the other of the big two and seeing, playing with their toys, as it were?
Right. Right. I working on the X-Men books, it was a dream job of mine, and I was lucky to do it for a long time. Um, and I was very happy at Marvel. I loved um, my bosses Dan Buckley and Joe Quesada, and working for them was great. Um, I had at that time what I felt was like a great creative roster on the books. It was when I brought Ed Brubaker onto Uncanny X-Men and Mike Carey onto X-Men. So I felt like they were like in a really good spot. And Joss, of course, was on Astonishing X-Men. I had this feeling like everything was like in a good spot. And I don't know, I also felt like, above me in the hierarchy, I had Ralph Macchio and Axel Alonso, and Tom Brevoort, who were all, I was very close with them and loved working with them. But, in my eyes, I was like, well, one of these guys is gonna have to, like,
Keel
fall into
over.
the river. Yeah. For me to, to keep moving up. And at the same time, I had been really friendly with Dan DiDio. He and I both lived in Jersey, so I'd always be on planes with him going to conventions. We'd always run into each other at Newark Airport, and we would talk and everything. And then I'd also see him at the annual Marvel DC softball game, because sometimes I would captain that and he would captain the DC team. So we had this, interaction, and we knew each other. And he approached me at one point and said, "Hey, I've been here a few years, and finally they're letting me hire my first new editor. And would you be interested?" And so I went and I talked to him and I talked to Paul Levitz, and uh, for me, it was just kind of the right move at the right time, and I didn't really put too much thought into it. A lot of times I just kind of act on my gut or by my gut, and this felt like the right move. So I made the jump over to DC, and a few months after I got there, Pete Tomasi left staff to become a writer full time, and uh, Dan gave me the Batman books.
And what was your impression of DC, especially as compared to Marvel, which is where you've spent most of the, your past decade, I'd say.
Yeah, it's funny. I've spent so much time at both companies, and about 13 years total at Marvel, and close to 8 years at DC. There's a lot of similarities between the companies, and a lot of differences too. Um, DC, a lot of people will say, oh, DC is more corporate, and that may be true. They may have been a little more structured than Marvel at the time. There was certainly a form for everything under the sun, and many different departments and many different people there with various job assignments. Um, but I quickly fell in love with the place, and it didn't take long. I loved the staff people there. I loved the creators I was working with. And in my eyes, that was going to be a place I would work for forever. Working on the Batman books was another dream come true, um, and really fortunate to work with so many fantastic creators. Scott Snyder, Grant Morrison, Andy Kubert, Tony Daniel, um, giving first assignments to people like Marguerite Bennett and James Tynan. Um, it was just a fantastic era of Batman books and Batman creators.
Would if you were given the choice of a line of comics at DC coming into it, would you have chosen Batman anyway?
Yeah, yeah, I would have. I mean, growing up, Marvel was always my thing. I was a Marvel zombie, but the one DC book that I always came back to was Batman. So, of all the characters there, I was certainly most familiar with Batman, and I felt most comfortable with Batman. And honestly, after working on the X books for so long, where it was, dozens and dozens of characters, the idea of working on one character and his handful of friends was really attractive to me.
Yeah. I can
Yeah.
see that after, such team-oriented books that have a little bit more of a focus, I guess, even though Batman sort of became a team in its own certain way. So before we get into kind of your next role, I wanted to ask about your editorial style. If you can even say, it's something that's sort of like ephemeral, right? Is there an editorial style, first of all? And what would you characterize your style as being? And did you feel like by the time you were at DC, you were pretty kind of like locked in, or were you still learning stuff? There are a lot of questions backed into that one.
No, that's okay. I can talk about that. I feel like by the time I got to DC, I certainly had developed my style, and that probably took place when I was at Marvel from 99 to 2006. And certainly by the end of my stay at Marvel there, the X-Men office had kind of grown into a franchise, or a group of books, and I had different editors working for me, and everyone was reporting up to me, and so I felt almost like I was running like a mini company in a way, like it was just
Mhm.
the X-Men company. And um, when I got to DC, I applied that same process to the Bat books, and I had a fantastic group of editors there that worked for me, and I just started doing the same exact thing that I'd done at Marvel, but whatever mistakes I'd made at Marvel or things that I wasn't happy with, I was able to perfect there at DC. So at DC, I feel like my editorial way of doing things really hit its stride, and I got the best out of not only my staff but also the best out of myself. Um, with a certain type of style, I'm very much into prep work. So knowing who I'm hiring before I hire them, getting familiar with their body of work, um, knowing what type of person they are, maybe trying them on something smaller before they get the big assignment, um, and also with story itself, outline, just working on the story so that it's really solid before we even see first script. Those things are important to me, the prep work, so that when it comes time to actually make the comic, uh, it's not like completely hands off, but you're able to kind of step back and let these superstars be superstars and to perform to the best ability and to allow them the freedom to do their own thing without it seeming like someone's breathing down their neck or micromanaging. Um, and also being able to recognize at what point it's wise to step in and say, hey, batter, we have to correct your swing a little bit. Let's try moving your foot here and take another swing and see how that works. And that takes practice and it takes time. And the thing is, just like in sports, and I always go to sports analogies when I talk about editing, but every creator is like every athlete. They're all different, and everyone has different strengths, weaknesses, quirks, personalities. So adjusting yourself to each one of them in your own unique way is essential when you want to try to get the best work out of them.
That's a very interesting approach that gives sort of structure, I think, at the beginning, but then once that structure is in place, even if it's not very finely detailed structure, then it's sort of freedom at the end because you've done, like you said, the prep, the foundational work. I would love to know, because it strikes me as if you're working with these big creators that you've maybe looked up to for a long time, and maybe it's your first time working with them. How difficult is it for you to take that leap and step in and say, I need to adjust your stance?
Yeah.
Because that would probably like scare the piss out of me.
Yeah.
At least the first time I did
it it can be tricky. I think in my time, I probably edited the work of three superstars. Um, so Joss Whedon was the first one, and fortunately with Joss, when he sends in a script, it's immaculate. Like it is flawless. Like you have to look for something that's wrong, or something that looks out of place, or um, all the characters behave how they should be. There are surprises and twists. He doesn't even make punctuation mistakes or typos or anything like that. It's incredibly flawless. Um, so that was kind of a dream assignment, and even working with him one on one, extremely accessible, um, and was interested in my opinion, which mattered. Um, the second time was with Neil Gaiman, and he came in to write a quick two-parter for Batman. Whatever happened to the Cape Crusader that Andy Kubert did work on. Um, Working with Neil was great. I mean, there were brilliant scripts, but I remember at the time, not surprisingly, he was working on many other projects, and I think the script came in several installments, and usually it was like run and gun. Like as soon as that script came in, I had to give it to Andy Kubert. We had to get these pages drawn, and again, you know, brilliance on the page. Um, I don't remember having to go back and suggest anything to Neil, except it was just like oh, you got your pagination wrong or something like that. I don't know. And the third time was with Kevin Smith, which was so much fun and a a challenging, I think, experience for an editor because Kevin comes in and Kevin is definitely going to do his thing, and he was writing Batman: The Widening Gyre with Walt Flanagan on artwork, and Kevin was another guy who was extremely acceptable. But he'd send in scripts, and Batman was making fart jokes and dick jokes, and I'm like, oh, oh no, you know, Batman's not supposed to do that, you know. Um, so that was really one of those cases where you kind of had to pick your own battles. And I remember going to Dan DiDio once or twice and being like, hey, yeah, we got this script from Kevin, and there's a few things in here I don't know if we can get through. And we kind of talked it through, and we're like, all right, we're gonna ask him to take out the dick joke, but we'll leave the fart joke. And Kevin was such a good sport about it. I think I think he knew he was pushing the envelope and wanted to see, how much we would give into.
Right.
So you know, he he was happy to make the alterations, or at least he acted happy. Yeah, but yeah, it's um, certainly working with those three, it really tests your abilities as an editor, and needing to speak up on behalf of the company or the character uh, when the need arises.
Makes sense. So now you're many years now into your editorial career, and you turn back to Marvel for a short stint, right, as executive editor. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? What does that position entail that might be different than what you'd been doing before? And why was it only a short amount of time?
Yeah, it was a short stint. It was at the time that DC decided to move their offices out to Los Angeles, and DC. I like I said, I loved DC. I loved working there, and they certainly made it attractive and enticing to go out to California. But I had too many things going on here. I had a child that was going into school, at a house. My whole family's in this area, so I made the decision pretty early on in the process to stay, and that meant trying to find employment in the comic industry out here on the East Coast. And I I had always kept up my great relationships at Marvel and my friendships there. I had never burned any bridges, and so I went back and inquired, and you know, fortunately at that time they were looking to move Steve Wacker from an editorial position out to the West Coast to essentially join the Marvel Films division to work on animation and stuff like that. So they just, you know, timing is everything. They happen to have a vacancy in the editorial department, and so I started talking to Dan Buckley about it, and they made an offer, and it was extremely generous, and asked me to come back as executive editor, which was a huge honor. And some of the guys that were kind of uh, in my way of advancement before, Ralph had retired, Ralph Macchio, and Axel had been promoted to editor in chief. Um, so I came in, and this was a good opportunity for me to start working on these books again. And uh, again, real fortunately, I got to work on the X-Men books, and Brian Bendis was spearheading those books at the time. And Brian and I, for a long time, I always kind of joked like, oh, we've known each other a long time, but we've never worked together. And then I was editing his two books in the X-Men and also his Guardians of the Galaxy book. So I was immediately immersed into Bendis books, which was so much fun. Brian is a night owl and does most of his writing at night, so I would come into the office around 8 o'clock, and a few days of the week I'd arrive to a new script from Brian, and it was always quiet in the office at that time, so that was kind of like, I'm going to read Brian's script, early in the morning. Um, you asked me before, like, if Marvel was different when I came back the second time. Well, when I came back the third time, it was very different to me. And it may not have been different to the people that worked there and who were in the trenches. But to me, who had been gone 8 years, it was a big adjustment. And I don't know if it was the um, Toy Biz aspect of it. I don't know if it was the Disney acquisition aspect of it. I don't know if it was new characters popping up that I wasn't familiar with. Um, staff changing. I'm not I'm not really sure, but for me, it was challenging. And I didn't want it to be a challenge. I wanted to just kind of go back to what I was doing and not skip a beat. Um, but I didn't. It was tough for me to kind of get back into the swing of things and get into the flow and to integrate myself into this newer Marvel that I wasn't familiar with. Um, so I internally struggled a bit, um, even though I was having fun on the books I was working on and had a great time with the creators I was working with. So, you know, a little over a year into my stay there, I got approached by Joe Pruitt, who was an old time friend of mine, and I used to use him as a writer on some of the X-Men books back in back at the time that the first X-Men movie came out. And Joe had told me that him and some other people he knew were starting a new comic book company, and they were looking for someone to be the editor in chief to run the creative aspect of it. And I thought about my time at DC, my time at Marvel, and kind of running these offices almost like they were mini businesses. And the idea of starting a company and building it from the ground up and starting from scratch and establishing systems and a foundation and starting something new and making noise, and also the idea of being an editor in chief. It was it was all attractive to me, and it again, my gut said this may be the right thing for me to do, and so I took the leap and started at Aftershock in I think April of 2015.
Well, I mean, it seems like the trajectory was taking you to an editor-in-chief job somewhere. And it's interesting that it was at a new place. Um, what was that experience like well, being in sort of the big cheese seat, as it were, and but also for a new venture as opposed to working with, these really established companies and characters. Um, was that like just a sea change? Did you have to, take some time to kind of get used to, that kind of not lifestyle, but that kind of environment?
Yes, it was challenging, and but it was at the same time that it was challenging, it was exciting and exhilarating. I had a lot of fun with Joe setting up this company, creating our wish list of people that we wanted to work with, projects that we wanted to launch with. Um, all of that was really fun. Building a publishing plan, building a way of doing things, hiring people. Um, and yes, there were differences. I mean, going to all the big shows and being at a big booth to suddenly going to the shows and being at a small table, was very different. Um, I don't think the job itself was that different for me. I always felt like I got to work and started my job the same way I always do in terms of putting books together and working with creators. Um, but there was a difference in not playing with someone's big exciting toys anymore, whether it's Batman or Guardians of the Galaxy or X-Men, and shifting to working with creators on their own pet projects, their own babies, and trying to breathe life into them and have them be the next big thing. Sales were different too. You go from a company where your best book was selling 100,000 copies, and then you go to a new company, and if you sell 20,000 copies, that's a huge win. So there was many differences, many challenges, but extremely exciting times.
Makes sense. Before we move on to your current gig at Mad Cave Studios, I'd love to know if there are particular books that stick out, even if they're sort of mainstream, but also if there are particular projects that you were proud of that maybe didn't get the attention on the first run around that you think deserve an extra look.
You mean with any of the places I worked?
With any of the places, yeah.
I had a great time on Frank Thierry and Sean Chen's Wolverine run. And at the time we were kind of like, I don't know, they let us do anything on that book. And Frank was always pushing the envelope to try crazier and crazier things. And we did it, and we had such a good time. And that's certainly one book that sticks out in my memory. Also starting Exiles with Judd Winnick was it was surprising to see something which just started as an idea within our office grow into a series that ran many years. And I think like me and my assistant Mike Rach, we were doing this book called X-Men Millennial Visions, which was kind of like a pinup book with different alternate realities of different versions of X-Men's and stuff like that. And that was so much fun that we thought like, oh, it would be great to do a whole book like this. And then we started talking to Judd Winnick, and we got Exiles off the ground. And in the beginning, we were like this close to it just being a limited series. I think it was approved as a project right around the time that Joe Quesada came in as editor-in-chief. It was probably approved before he became editor-in-chief. And then when he was boss, he took a look and he was like, I think this is probably just a limited series. And like myself, I was still kind of young at the time, and I was like kind of like taken aback, and I probably didn't have enough courage to like stand up for myself and say why I wanted it to be an ongoing series. And Tom Brevoort stepped in, and Tom was like, no, this should be an ongoing series. And Joe was like, okay, all right, we'll do it, ongoing series. But it's just those like little decision like that happens in a split second that can affect years of work. So that was another project that was a lot of fun that I look back fondly.
Yeah, there are those little inflection points in a career that can take you on one path or another. And
yeah,
I'm glad Exiles is in the world. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
I'm not the only one, I'm sure.
Yeah, me too. And at DC, I had so much fun getting Jim Shooter back on Legion of Superheroes and pairing him up with Francis Manipul. I don't know. I remember telling DiDio my idea, and he was enthusiastic but skeptical. And then he said, "You got to run it by the big guy," meaning Paul Levitz. And Paul, Paul's like, if you can make it happen, you have my blessing. And I was like, all right. So, and then I approached Jim, and Jim came back and wrote, I think like a year and a half worth of stories with us. And that was fun as well.
Awesome. Well, let's get to your current work, or the past 2 years you spent at Mad Cave Studios as editor-in-chief and executive vice president or vice publisher. Can you tell us a little bit more about the company, and when you came on, what was your impression, and where did you want to steer the ship, as it were?
Yeah, well, Mad Cave caught my attention about 2 years ago when they acquired Paper Cuts. For a while, I knew Mad Cave from the conventions, and they were, similar in scope and size to Aftershock. So, they were, friendly competition, as it were. And but then when they made the acquisition of Paper Cuts, I took a step back and I'm like, this company's different. They're for real. They're in it for the long term. They realize that we may not be able to survive just on the direct market, even though we have such fun in the direct market, that we need more. We need the book market. And that coupled with, I think, throughout your career, you come across certain individuals that stand out more than others. And you gravitate towards them. And sometimes you want to work for them. I look back in my career and, Nell Yomtov was certainly that type of person, Dan DiDio, Dan Buckley, Bob Harris, and Mark London, the CEO of Mad Cave, became one of these people to me too. Mark has such a infectious, enthusiastic attitude that once you start talking to him about plans and what's coming and what he wants to accomplish and how no challenge is insurmountable, you become one of Mark's people, and you want to stay there. So the idea of working for Mark was very attractive to me. And the idea that Mad Cave was a publisher that appealed to many different demographics. In my experience at other companies, there was just kind of usually one target area, whether it was superheroes for teens or creator-owned for adults. But Mad Cave had a multi-pronged approach where we could tell creator-owned stories to adults. We could do the big popular licenses like Dick Tracy and Flash Gordon for people who enjoy pop culture. They had young adult graphic novels that could appeal to that audience. And then with Paper Cuts, you open up the whole world of middle grade publishing, which is so popular and so immense these days. And, for the first time in forever, I could say publishing material that I'm happy to give to my kids and to share with my kids. So that whole idea of the comics for everyone, or a comic book for everyone, was one of the main draws for me at Mad Cave.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the imprints. You mentioned Paper Cuts, and then there's also Maverick, which is, I assume, the not middle grades book publisher. Or do I have that backwards?
Paper Cuts is the middle grade publisher, so that's for our younger readers, and then Maverick is our young adult line.
Young adult. Okay.
Yep.
Great. So that all sounds great. I mean, it sounds like a different experience than you've probably had before in terms of the diversity of audiences that you are trying to entice and engage. I guess a question for this, because it's not necessarily a new venture, but I mean, you're obviously integrating Paper Cuts and you're sort of taking it in a little bit of a new direction. How do you get these books, whether it's the adult, whether it's a young adult or middle grades, to really stick out in what has become, in all aspects, in all audiences, a very crowded marketplace? Is there a strategy to that now, given that you're playing in all these different markets?
Yeah, there certainly is, and it can change day to day, week to week. It requires great knowledge of the industry itself and the trends. And I'm not saying I possess all that knowledge, but it's something that we, as a company, try to absorb, and being aware of where the industry has gone, what the right steps have been, what the wrong steps have been, trying to forecast where it's going and being able to bend and be flexible enough to adapt with how the industry is going to change, it requires us as a company to be extremely selective and picky, which sometimes is difficult because it means saying no to some great creators and their ideas. But we're very careful in the projects we select. We feel something has to really stand out, have a unique voice, be able to reach a wide demographic. Essentially it has to be able to sell. And in the absence of that, at least has to be something that would garner an award or be some type of strategic project that leads us to something even better in the future. So there's a lot of different factors at play when selecting the books that we do. But the key of it all is being selective, and you don't want too much in the way of repetition. You don't want too much overlap between specific projects. You want to try to have a diverse representation of creators working on the books that are all able to bring their A game. So it's many different things that kind of play into how we develop our publishing line.
And as we're, coming to a close, I'd love to know what Mad Cave has coming up that, of course, you can talk about. There's, I'm sure, some stuff that you can't. But what can we have to look forward to in terms of the Mad Cave output?
The most exciting thing currently in the direct market space are the licenses that we've been fortunate enough to acquire and develop projects for. So that includes Gotcha Man, which debuts this month, Flash Gordon, which debuts next month, and Dick Tracy, which debuted 3 months ago. In the paper cuts space, we entered into a big relationship with Disney. So we have Disney product that's coming out later this year, and we'll be, continuing into the near future with a really great cross section of various IPs from Disney. And I think something that will appeal to every different type of Disney fan, fans of Disney princesses, some of the more classic stuff, and then some of the even newer properties that have debuted over the last 3 or 4 years. So those are the things that I think coming from Mad Cave are the most exciting over the next year.
Hey, everybody. What did you think of that interview with Mike? I loved it. Loved talking to anybody involved in the comic book industry, especially those that I've kind of overlapped in my 2 years within Marvel. And I remember Mike as being a very pleasant, amiable, and, competent guy, and certainly has made a space for himself in the comic book world, and wish him all the luck in the world with Mad Cave Studios. They seem like they're doing really well. So we have Mike to thank for that. And thank you, Mike, for being on the program. Before we wrap up, I wanted to let everybody know, I think Oren already told you, but we have a review contest going on. What is a review contest? That means if you guys go on to mostly Apple Podcasts, but wherever you can review, give us 5 stars, write a nice review, take a screenshot of it, send it to dollarbenbandits@gmail.com or put it somewhere on our social. You will be entered for the chance to win 30 Dollar Bin comics. That's 30 to celebrate our 3 years of broadcasting this podcast. And yeah, it'll be a good mix. They almost definitely will be worth more than $30. And right now there's only 2 competitors. So, I mean, get in there. You have a really good chance of winning. And who knows, maybe I'll throw you a few comics anyway. So yeah, go to Apple Podcasts, 5 stars, review, screenshot, send it to us, and you'll be entered to win the contest. And that goes until July 30th. So get those reviews in. But that'll do it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for rating, reviewing, subscribing, being part of the contest. And we'll see you next issue. Peace.